Normally when I get up to speak with such an introduction, people wonder, how did this guy with an American accent end up becoming the biggest investor in Russia and the biggest enemy of the state of Russia? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about my own background, which will lead into what happened to me in Russia, which I think you'll find interesting. So I indeed have an American accent because I'm from America, but I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, came from Wichita, Kansas, and in the 1920s, he became a labor union organizer in Wichita. And he was so good in Wichita that they invited him to organize the union in Kansas City. And he was so good in Kansas City that they invited him to come to New York City. And this was around 1927. In New York City, there were a bunch of communists running around. And they said, if you like labor unions, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia? And so Earl Browder, my grandfather, went to Russia in 1927. And he met my grandmother, and my father was born there. And in 1932, 5 years after arriving, they said, why don't you go back to America and become head of the American Communist Party, which he did. So my grandfather was head of the American Communist Party from 1932 to 1945. He ran for president twice on the communist ticket against Franklin Roosevelt. He was actually the first presidential candidate to ever have a black running mate. Now, I'm not a communist, or I wouldn't be standing here telling you a story about capitalism, but this had a very dramatic and powerful impact on my own life. As you all know, in the 1950s, so my grandfather got kicked out of the Communist Party in 1945. He spent 5 years in the wilderness, and then the 1950s began, and that was when Joseph McCarthy came in. And it didn't matter whether you were a good communist or a bad communist. If you were a communist during McCarthy's time, you had a pretty horrible time. And so my grandfather spent many a day in front of the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities. My father, who was a professor coming out of Princeton Graduate School, couldn't get a job in any university in America. It was very tough times. But eventually, the McCarthy era ended, and my family normalized, and I was born in 1964 and grew up on the south side of Chicago as a normal American kid in a slightly abnormal family. And when I got to my teenage years, I went through my rebellion, as I'm sure many of you did when you were teenagers. But how do you rebel when you come from a family of communists? Well, I'll tell you how I rebelled. I put on my suit and tie and became a businessman. There was nothing I could do to make my family more uncomfortable than that. There was nothing worse than being a businessman in the Browder family. And I went to Stanford Business School. And so I go to Stanford Business School, and if any of you are MBAs here, you know that a big part of business school is to try to figure out what you're going to do after business school. And as I was searching my soul, I was coming up with no clear answers. I didn't have the same benefits that some of my colleagues had. If they came from a long line of investment bankers, then it was sort of the obvious thing to go to Wall Street. Or if you came from a family of real estate developers, then that seemed like the obvious choice. But what did I come from? But all of a sudden, I had a lucky break. In 1989, as I was just finishing business school, the Berlin Wall came down. And I said to myself, well, here's a really obvious opportunity. I come from a long line of communists, and the Berlin Wall has just come down. I'm going to become a capitalist in Eastern Europe. So I moved to London, and I get a job at the Boston Consulting Group because they told me that if they ever have any work to do in Eastern Europe, I can be their Eastern European guy. So I sit there for a few months, and one day an assignment comes in. There's a bus factory 6 hours from Warsaw on the Ukrainian border, and they need a consultant. And so they send me out to this bus factory, and this was at a very strange time in Poland when there was food shortages and hyperinflation and the phones didn't work. It was all very terrible. And I found it very, very uncomfortable living in this Polish town. And I wasn't sure what I was doing with myself there, and I was having all sorts of crisis of confidence. And one day, my interpreter, who went with me everywhere at this bus factory, was carrying a newspaper under his arm, and I was looking at the newspaper, and there was all these financial figures in the newspaper. And I said to him, what's in the newspaper? What are all those financial figures? He said, oh, those are the very first privatizations that we're doing in Poland. I said, that's interesting. And I said, can you show me the numbers? So we sat down at a table and we started going through the numbers. And it turned out that Poland was selling the first 6 companies in their privatization program. And they were valuing the companies at 1/2 of the company's earnings. Now, I wasn't the best student in business school, but I figured if the company was worth 1/2 of their earnings, then all they had to do was stay in business for 6 months and you kind of got your money back. And I didn't have any money. I had hardly any money of my own at that point in time. I had about $4,000 of savings. But I thought to myself, this has got to be the most unbelievable economic opportunity I've ever seen. And again, I wasn't an experienced investor at all, but I took my entire life savings of $4,000 and I converted it into Polish zloty, and I went down to the post office and I bought shares in a number of these companies that were being privatized. 12 months later, my shares were worth 10 times what I had paid for them in the privatization. My $4,000 had turned into $40,000. And I can tell you, and if any of you have had an experience where you've made 10 times your money on anything, it releases a certain chemical in your stomach. It's a really good feeling that just goes down like that. And you want to repeat it. It's an addictive feeling. And so at that point, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to invest in privatizations in Eastern Europe, and I was sure there was going to be more. So if we fast forward a couple years, I end up getting a job at Salomon Brothers in 1992. And if any of you have ever read the book Liar's Poker, Salomon Brothers was a very special firm. And if you haven't read the book Liar's Poker, you should absolutely go out and get it. Salomon Brothers was one of these dog-eat-dog firms where every man for himself. And I show up at Salomon Brothers on the Eastern European investment banking team. And they give me my desk, they give me my business cards, and they say to me, now go out and earn 5 times what we're paying you, otherwise you get fired. No training program, no mentors, no explanation of how you actually go out and do this. That was the job. So I started to wander around the firm trying to figure out how I'm going to earn 5 times what they were paying me. And I hear that there is a meeting going on between people discussing the privatization of the Hungarian airline. And so without an invitation, I show up at this meeting, and people look at me like I've got like a big turd on my head or something like that as I've walked into this meeting. And they said, Bill, we're absolutely fully staffed. We don't need anyone to help us with this privatization. Please don't come here for this meeting. Because they didn't want to share their 5 times with anybody else because they didn't want to be fired. About a week later, there was a meeting on the privatization of the Polish telephone company. And I, again, show up to that meeting, and a different group of people are even less polite than the people in the Hungarian team and tell me don't even come anywhere near Poland. So I wonder what am I going to do with myself, because I've got to figure out some type of activity to be gainfully employed. And I look around and nobody is doing anything about Russia. There's no business in Russia, no investment banking and business in Russia. There's no meetings going on about Russia. So I declare myself the investment banker in charge of Russia.